on Syria. And this is something, obviously, the US doesn't like, depending on which part you talk about. If we're talking about those who belong to the global liberal elite, these are the ones who are most against it. If we're talking about Donald Trump, this is a bit more unknown factor. I mean, he seems to be a bit ambivalent about it. He's positioned himself in terms of his reputation and brand as opposing global liberalism, and the periodic moves to try and withdraw US forces from Syria invariably result in a chemical weapons attack all of a sudden, which forces US troops to stay there longer. But for all intents and purposes, the initiative is lost, and this was clearly seen from September 2015 with the direct Russian intervention. And this, of course, creates a new set of dynamics within that regionalism, because Turkey, which is part of NATO, but is also cooperating with Russia, and it is an ally of the US, but is also cooperating with Iran. And so a whole lot of different dynamics have started up, which are unravelling that particular system as we know it. And of course the US has not been acting at all with Turkish interests, especially security in mind, because what we saw with Iraq, which has led to various military interventions into northern Iraq, they repeated the same thing in northern Syria, in protecting those enclaves of proxies there. So what we see is that this means that it's a very difficult game, if we want to call it that, for Turkey to maintain, because on the one hand, it's part of the Western system of alliance. Excuse me, bloody phone goes at the most inconvenient times. But so on the one hand, the foreign security policy has to sort of, that fine line to balance between what is happening in terms of these, I would call them self-destructive tendencies of US and EU foreign and security policy, and on the other side, these more pragmatic foreign and security policies of non-Western countries and non-Western powers, such as, I mean, we've got China, Iran, Russia, and so it's a careful balance, but one that needs to be done in the, I think, for at least the short term. What happens in the future, it's quite unpredictable, but my understanding, and not only my understanding, there's quite a few others who tend to agree that this transformation and evolution of the global order, it's begun, and it's not something that can be reversed or stopped. So to have this independent path that we're to pursue your own foreign and security interests is the best possible path at the moment, rather than being this vassal state where interests are ignored and quite often compromised. So I'll stop there.
Please, questions?
Thank you. I would like to have your opinion on, especially on Turkish-Russian relations. What do you see the future will be? Are we going to closer with Russia and leave the NATO or not? What do you think?
Okay, so for my blunt and direct opinion. So, I mean, Turkey and Russia do have mutual interests and objectives to pursue now, but also historically there is some, should we say, baggage from the past that needs to be negotiated and dealt with. So, I mean, the past is always going to influence the present and the future. But I think given this evolution of the global order, that it should increase the level of possibility and collaboration. I mean, I don't necessarily think that will mean that Turkey needs to leave NATO or something. This does not have to be this zero-sum, one or the other, even though these are quite often presented that way. But then the different circumstances can change. And of course, in addition to having mutual interests and objectives, there are also exclusive interests and objectives. And as long as you both, Turkey and Russia, understand that not only do you have things you can collaborate on, but there are other things which you cannot collaborate on, but need to be aware of where the other side is at on those particular issues.
First of all, thank you for your valuable presentation. Actually, it is very difficult to grasp what kind of a great power the United States of America is, because it's always failing in Eurasian basin after the Cold War. So, what do you think? What is the reason for that, for this failure? It's geographical position, or it's foreign policy making? What's the main reason here? And actually, we, the Turks, actually, in the recent years, cannot understand the targets of the American foreign policy in our region. Okay. Actually, what do you think about foreign policy aims, objectives of America in the Middle East or in Central Asia, the Caucasus? And what is the American narrative actually here? What they say about that? Okay. Thank you.
So, okay, to begin with what I think of American foreign and security policy, in short, it's insane. Because it absolutely goes against their actual interests and security. So it's not about pursuing it at all. But I think one of the problems which links into this is the fact that from 1946 with Bretton Woods, the US kicked away any last pretense of Pax Britannica. I mean, it was already finished after the First World War, but took a couple more decades to finally die. And this meant that it sees itself as head of the free world, and which came under the disguise of this liberalism. And if you look at liberalism, it's about the free movement of people and ideas, money and trade. So this multiculturalism, globalization. Now, this began to take on a somewhat messianic format, insofar as you got these things like democratic peace, this idea that democracies don't fight with each other. So the more democracies there are, the less war and misery there is. However, that ignores the fact that a democracy is far more likely to attack a non-democracy than the other way around, which we've seen countless times, especially in the region. And there's also the assumption that if you do regime change, the country which you've done regime change on and install a puppet government, call it a democracy, that it will be your friend. because it's dependent on you for security and continuance of that particular government. But I mean, once more, no, no, no. I mean, look at Iraq. I mean, the invasion of Iraq, as bad as it is, did have an interesting positive outcome in that it actually ended millennia of hostility between Iran and Iraq. They're as close as they've been because of that. I can also remember I was giving a presentation about the human cost of humanitarian wars in Moscow, and there's a gentleman that came up to me afterwards and said, my name is blah blah blah, I'm the Minister for Agriculture, so he's part of Karzai's government, and he said, what you said about Iraq, this is exactly what the Americans are doing to us in Afghanistan. So, I mean, this was a tributary state, but it was not feeling protected and it was not feeling happy. And bearing in mind that the existence of that government relied on American hard power. And I mean, looking at the US now, I mean, it's essentially at war with itself. I mean, you got it into the liberal and conservative elements. I mean, I can remember a road trip from Chicago to Champaign-Urbana was about 7 years ago, and the guy had been doing tours in Iraq, and he said, well, yeah, I mean, the troops are basically spending half the time stoned on different kinds of drugs, and he said the main recruits of the US Army at the time were from these different militia and neo-Nazi gangs, because what they believed that the US was heading towards a civil war, and so their option was to get as many battle-trained soldiers within their ranks for when this war came. And of course, if there is a civil war, it won't be like 1861 to 5.